Francisco?
Yes.
I need the polling questions and the ability to share my screen to put up the slide. I'm gonna go ahead and share the content and that'll push it to the webcast.
Okay, I think we will kick this off. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for being with us today. I'm Jennifer Artley, and I run the Technology, Life Sciences, and Business Services channel at BT Global, as well as lead BT in the Americas. Today's event is about the very, very rapidly evolving future of work. And our intention isn't actually to share a broadcast on the topic, but rather to stimulate a discussion from three very different perspectives that explores how our collective imagination of this future is changing as we look back at our experiences over the past few months. I think in this moment, a lot of us, certainly I do, feel like we are really building the plane as we're flying it. And while that isn't normally how we would choose to go about leading, it's exactly where we are. And so I think we are all pivoting. I'm sure many of you, like myself and the panelists here, have attended industry events over the past few years where we talk about how to deal with the uncertainty of the future. But I think what I've learned in the past 6 to 8 weeks is that we are much more resilient and much more adaptive than we ever thought. Here at BT, there have been some extraordinary stories, some things that didn't even seem possible just a few months ago. And I've heard even more brilliant stories from our customers and in our communities. Barriers that we thought existed, like technology adoption and process change, have really vanished overnight. And to some extent, the future of work that we had imagined for several years out has definitely arrived early. So we know now that the future of work isn't a destination, it's a journey. And now that the rules have changed, we really need to all take this opportunity to rethink our assumptions and redefine what the future is that lies ahead. So now, to begin a conversation around the rapidly evolving future of work, we've brought together 3 experts across different disciplines of thought leadership to share their insights. And I'm hoping this is going to be a great conversation. Today, I'm joined by an organizational psychologist, a technological psychologist, and a technologist. Bijal Choksi joins us. She's an organizational psychologist specializing in unlocking individuals and teams' full potential through self-awareness and skilling up. She's a partner at HughWork, which is a consulting and coaching organization whose mission is to inspire humans at work. Dr. Nicola Millard is a principal innovation partner at BT. She's half social scientist, half technologist, and entirely academic, a presenter, writer, and researcher on the topics of innovation and the future of work. And lastly, we have Steve Whitaker. He is our technologist, and he's a chief research professional in BT's AI, Service, Security, and Operations Research Lab. He manages BT's partnerships with US research universities and business schools, spends a lot of time with MIT, and is a computer scientist by training. So why don't each of you give a quick introduction? Bijal?
Hi, Jen. So happy to be here today. And I'd say in general, if I had to summarize my perspective, it's that life is short and precious. And so live it intentionally and mindfully.
Thank you. Nicola?
Wow, gosh, I've got to try and beat that now, haven't I? So, hello, my name's Nicola. I'm a psychologist by background, so we've got a lot of psychologists on this session, and I've been throughout my career actually involved with a lot of stuff around the future of work, which oddly seemed to arrive in the past month. So I've been with BT for a very long time. I'm part of BT's innovation team, and actually, one of my first jobs in BT was to run one of actually Europe's first homeworking trials, and that was back in 1992. And in some ways we've come a long way, in some ways we haven't come a long way since then. So I think I've been running a program around the future of work research for about 9 years. And I always say I look at the most disruptive part of innovation, really, which is us, and how, you know, our attitudes change and how we start to embrace technologies to enable us to do stuff in really different ways. And I think this big global experiment we're in at the moment is exploring the boundaries of those different ways. So yeah, it's going to be hopefully a good discussion we've got today.
Well, thank you, Nicholas. I'm Steve. So as Jen mentioned, I'm not a psychologist, I'm a technologist, but I've always been very interested in the interaction between society and technology and how technology enables change. You know, from my perspective, technology is our servant, it's not our master. So the next 2 years are going to be very difficult one way or another, but I remain fundamentally optimistic about the long-term trajectory we're on. And the reason for that is that technology does 2 main things for us. One is it gives us superpowers. Some of those have been physical superpowers, they're knowledge superpowers, organizational superpowers, collaborative superpowers. And then secondly, technology democratizes scarce skills and resources. It enables people to have things that previously only the privilege of the rich and the well-staffed. So to my mind, there's really the 2 greatest technologies that we've ever created. One is society itself, and the other one is a scientific method. And with those 2, there's really not a great deal you can't achieve with time and resources.
Excellent. All right. So before we start the conversation, I want to encourage the audience to ask questions at any time using our Q&A chat box, and we'll try to pick them up as they come in. Some of you have pre-submitted questions, and our experts will try to weave some of the answers into the points they make during our discussion. So let's get started. Bijal, I'm going to tee this up for you to kick us off. So I think it's pretty clear we all realize there is a new normal in how we work. And across the globe, our expectations of what work in the future will look like have definitely shifted. Many of us have talked for a while now about the skills of the future workplace being things like critical thinking and emotional intelligence and adaptability. But it feels like there's a need to accelerate the learning and application of those skills of the future. So my question is, are those previously identified skills enough? And are they even the right skills?
Yeah, such an interesting question. And I don't think that they're enough. I think we can do more. And if we take a look at some of the trends that are happening right now, there are leaner workforces. There's a smaller physical office footprint. And as a result of those trends, I'm seeing a trend of power, official power, moving down through the org structure, down to the team leader level. And so now it's more important than ever that those frontline managers are skilled up, and with skills that probably were not included in their original onboarding material. Skills like emotional regulation, to be able to lead effectively. Things like psychological safety. How do they make sure that their employees feel safe? Because without that, they cannot show up and be their best selves. Skills like, how do you inspire your team members instead of micromanaging that may have happened more in the past? And then also a skill around empowerment. How do we drive some of that decision-making down to the lowest levels in the organization so that companies can be more agile and respond to customers quickly? So that's kind of at that key team leader level. And then I'd say, more broadly, just across the board, one critical skill that every person needs, regardless of title, is resiliency. And Jen, you touched on this in your introduction, but resiliency is really the capacity to prepare for, bounce back after, and adapt in the face of stress. Because right now, it's COVID-19. We know something else will be coming up in the future. And isn't it true that it's not really the stressor itself that matters? It's how you as an individual and how your fellow team members are responding to that stress that really matters. So companies that can develop these resilient employees will come out ahead regardless of what the landscape looks like.
That is really interesting. Nicola, do you want to build on that at all?
Yeah, I think absolutely the skills are starting to change, and we've been seeing this, pre-COVID-19 as workforces tended to be virtualizing and globalizing. Actually, one of the things that exposes is sometimes that the skill sets we need in our leaders are quite different. I always say that office working is quite an interesting one, and obviously I've been doing a lot on the changing nature of the office. And I think sometimes leaders get quite lazy when they're office based, because they look around, they see people, they look as if they're working. Brilliant, let's go back into my office. And actually, what this crisis has done, and what actually we should have been doing with remote and virtualized teams anyway, is a very different type of leadership skill that is more around, I guess, connecting people and creating a purpose for collaboration. And we've been doing quite a lot on collaboration itself. And I always say collaboration is an interesting one because it does not happen by magic. Even if you co-locate people in an office, that doesn't mean they necessarily collaborate. Collaboration is a leadership challenge because it's all about leaders creating, firstly, that vision and purpose that get people together. And then for virtualized collaboration, to be honest, a lot of the collaboration tools are not the problem. I think the problem is there are a lot of collaboration tools. And again, what we found is that just throwing collaboration technologies at the problem doesn't solve it. Actually, what leaders then need to do is select the right tool for the right problem. I call it creation of common ground. So in other words, whatever you're going to collaborate on, whether it's physical or increasingly at the moment digital, leaders have to say, we're going to be here, that's appropriate for the task, and it's accessible to everybody who needs to be here. So I think, you know, it is challenging a lot of these lazy leadership skills that we fell in when we could actually just physically see people, and it's forcing leaders to manage in a very, very different, empathetic way. So yeah, I think there's a lot of things that this crisis is exposing in terms of the people aspects of managing virtualized teams.
And Steve.
So I think I'd add kind of 3 additional perspectives to that. So So one is that what's been clear is organizations that were further along their digital journey when COVID-19 struck have been adapting more effectively in the current crisis. And that suggests that some of the behaviors that were emerging in the lead up are going to become more and more important as we go forward. So things like collaboration across disciplines, the ability to marshal resources dynamically and to build communities, the ability to build trust, to communicate, to be able to deliver and to be accountable in very different ways. And I think as we just mentioned, so accountability frameworks kind of change in this kind of environment, from command and control to very different kinds of distributed leadership. Secondly, I think this is happening against a backdrop of fundamental changes in work that have been at play over the last 20, 30 years. And we've very much seen a bifurcation of the workplace between high skill, high wage jobs and low skill, relatively low skill, relatively low wage jobs. And the middle has collapsed. And that's been particularly true in the kind of in the Western countries. Similarly, education has been a premium in that. So we've seen the rewards from the economy going to those people with the most education. Neither of those is going to change. That's going to be the backdrop against which the changes are going to play out. So, and we're seeing that with the the kind of the sorts of roles that are adapted best to home working and the ones that are struggling most in terms of being often forced to work in very risky workplaces. None of that will change without significant action and collaboration across an agreement across the economy as to what kind of economy-wide workforce we want. And the third one is that the economy will always value the skills to build and to exploit the transformative technology of the time. And I think at the current time and going forward for quite a while, that's going to be things like computer science, it's going to be things like the ability to use data, and it's the ability to be able to apply those to a broad range of problems. And they include problems in management and marketing, problems in drug discovery, problems in new materials, problems in organizations, problems in engineering. So that, along with a passion for learning and for applying those technologies in a very changing world, are going to be key. And I really like the points about adaptability. I'd also add to that the kind of entrepreneurship. So that's kind of an active adaptability and a passion for change, and a passion for positive change, and a passion for building the communities and the consensus to get the kinds of change that we think we want in a given circumstance, be it technical, political, or economic.
Excellent. All right, I'm going to come back to I'm going to come back to you in a second, Steve. You touched on something really interesting, but before I do, I would love to engage with the audience. And on your screens right now, you should see our poll question, and we'll share your responses a little bit later in the session. So Steve, you touched on transformative technologies, and the next conversation I want to tee up is about the coexistence of what is often perceived to be two extremes. So we know the future of work is rapidly changing. We know that technology is moving at pace, and that adoption of certain technologies, especially collaboration, as you said, has accelerated. But as companies are trying to understand productivity, and maybe this touches some of what Bijal talked about, and are leveraging AI as a transformative technology more than ever to gauge productivity, the question becomes, are AI and human centricity two opposite ends of the spectrum? And where or how do they come together?
Yeah, I think it's a very, very deep question. I think one way to come at it is to look at the bigger issue. And I think from its original roots in the 1940s and 1950s, AI has always been a fundamentally human-centered kind of endeavor. So I think there's an increasing consensus that the emphasis should be on human augmentation, on the augmentation of society and organizations, giving ourselves new superpowers of various forms, not an automation for automation's sake. So, for example, if you look at autonomous vehicles, the reason for doing autonomous vehicles isn't to displace cab drivers and truckers and to save money. It's to fundamentally rethink the way that we move everything around the economy. And that's at every scale, from individual packages and robots in factories and homes through to fleets of ships, those sorts of things. So it's a very, very different kind of perspective. And it's what effectively we've done with everything else. It's what we've done with light, what we've done with energy, what we've done with healthcare, is to basically democratize these superpowers to be able to organize against problems at larger scale. This bigger story, I think, is also a very human story. So Joi Ito always refers to extended intelligence, the ability to use these sorts of technologies to make us smarter, more connected, more creative, healthier. Tom Malone at MIT always talks about machine-mediated hyperconnectivity, using machines to work with people to create communities that are larger and more effective than any individual or any group of humans could be in the past. I think also this idea that there's only a limited number of interesting things to do is really flawed. And this idea that what's called the kind of the lump labor fallacy, that if we automate something, there's no work left for anybody else. No, nothing interesting for anybody else to do. I think is really the wrong way to look at it. There's always things that we would really rather be doing than working in coal mines and silk mills. But progress is always difficult, complex, and hard. There's one issue is the technology always takes longer to achieve its promise than we thought it would, and the impacts. So for example, Darren Acemoglu talks about socio-technologies, technologies that automate without enabling growth, and how to deal with that. Eric Brynjolfsson talks about the J-curve, this idea of slightly worse before better as we build the complementary tools and skills to exploit technology. And there are always kind of winners and losers in the short term during these periods of turbulence, and history has always showed us that. So our job as kind of leaders and policymakers is to kind of ensure that we do this in a way that everybody benefits and we don't leave people behind. And a lot of that's to do with training and education. It's to do with community. It's to do with regional initiatives, industry initiatives. It's to do with investing in our friends and neighbors. I think that the picture in the long term is very positive, but we have to agree as a society how we're going to approach some of the turbulence in the same way that we should have done that when we approached things like trade shocks and some of the changes that went on in the 70s and 80s. But I think generally, it's a very human-centered enterprise.
Thank you. Nicola, do you want to chime in?
I certainly do. Yeah, I mean, I love augmented intelligence rather than artificial intelligence, because I think machines are good at certain things, we're good at other things, and actually there's not a huge amount of intersection. But the work I'm doing at the moment is really around how does COVID-19 actually affect business strategies into the future of work. And I think talking to some of the economists around the world, one of the things that they've been saying is traditionally out of a crisis, obviously you get things like cost cutting. So you look at cost, that there's also a lot around automation. And I think a lot of automation, certainly if we look to China initially, as to what they're doing now, what they are tending to do are automating and putting robots, for example, into factories, because we've got social distancing that's making all sorts of things a bit awkward at the moment. So actually, in terms of capacity management in factories, putting a robot in makes a lot of sense. It doesn't replace the human. It's just that, you've got social distancing as one problem. Obviously, robots don't need PPE. Robots are unlikely to get sick. So we're getting a sudden increase in the possibilities of automating certain things that actually it's the dull, the dirty, and the dangerous, as a lot of people say around future automation. But going back to just briefly, Steve's comment around productivity, I've always said productivity is one of these big ones that needs to be redefined in a digital era. And actually, AI is one of the things that makes this complicated, because what AI tends to do is the stuff that's easy to define, the rules-based stuff, the process-based stuff. And therefore, by definition, is also quite easy to measure. It leaves us humans with all of the stuff that we're pretty good at doing, but a lot of that stuff is chaotic and complex and emotive, and therefore, by definition, is quite difficult to measure using traditional productivity measures. Does that make us redundant? No, it doesn't. It's just our value is slightly different than some of those very traditional factory-based, widget-based, input-output based productivity measures that we tend to use. So a lot of this, again, this started before COVID, a lot of this is disrupting very fast, and we probably do need to think about how do we measure productivity in the first place.
Excellent, thanks. Bijal?
Yeah, I'll offer a different perspective, one of a little bit more skepticism. I see this as a slippery slope, whether it's AI in the sense of artificial intelligence or augmented intelligence. And the reason why I say that is that I worry about the impact on us as human employees. And if I recall, just looking back at history, around 1981, IBM, which is a company I used to work for, launched the personal computer. And over the next couple of decades, they popped up everywhere, right? And it became really commonplace in the corporate world. And it was touted as the savior of our lifestyle. We were all of a sudden going to be so much more productive, and we'd end up with more leisure hours. And what ended up happening, right? The complete opposite. And so now we have these blurred boundaries between work and personal life. And I don't know about you, but my husband and I, we're always on text and email. We feel like work is never really turned off now. And so what's next? Even if we go with the augmented intelligence side, I mean, what's next? We're gonna augment ourselves with a chip in our head so we can continue to be productive while we're asleep. And why? This nonstop churning of work is good for software, but the human operating system works differently. We need periods of rest and renewal. We need real social connection. We need time for reflection. And I would just urge us right now, in this moment, we have this rare opportunity in society, almost an obligation, I would say, for those in leadership roles to pause and mindfully think about the future that we really want for ourselves, for our teams, for our organizations, and for our children.
Can I just add to that as well? A lot of the work that we've been doing, particularly around the shift to home working, have been precisely around that. Now, BT's been home working for a very long time. As I said, our first trials were in 1992. Some of our home workers have been working from home for over 20 years. And I must confess, I was not one of them. I'd studied them, but had not really been a home worker. And I'm rubbish at it. And partially it is that it's almost the ultimate clash, that ultimate blurring of boundaries, in that now my home is my workplace. So when do I turn off? And absolutely, to your point, Bijal, it's really around, how do I redefine those boundaries? And actually talking, and we just produced a paper based on what our home workers told us worked for them. And a lot of it was around reestablishing those boundaries and making time to turn off and be mindful and rest and be healthy, rather than that almost pressure. And I think, again, this goes back to my productivity thing. Some people might equate productivity to being chained to their home desk for 8, 9, 10 hours a day because they need to look productive because they're not in the office anymore. That's probably not a productive way of working, and certainly isn't a sustainable way of working. So simply around building in, that thinking time, that refresh time, sleep time is a really healthy way of being more productive rather than less.
Yeah, that's a great point. And some questions are coming in, but before I go to one of those questions, Rachel, I'm curious about your thoughts on Philip's point on redefining productivity. So you obviously make a very human-centric argument, which I think is important for us to make sure we're caring for ourselves. But redefining productivity, what does that mean for you?
That's a tough one. I mean, I have a business background, and so I understand the need for revenue and for a company to do well. But in terms of human productivity, I think it's individual for each person. I think that for some of us, it may be a creator role. And so is that happening for us? Are we being productive in that side? For others, it may be connection within the team. And so there's productivity around that. I mean, both Nicola and Steve also mentioned collaboration. And there's some productivity measures around that too. So, I wish there was just a quick one-word answer I could give you, Jen, but I do think it's really complex when it comes to human productivity.
I think we all agree, though, it's not how many hours you're logged in or how long you're sitting in your chair. That's for sure.
Can I just chip in with a very quick comment on that? So I think productivity is a really interesting question because there's so many dimensions to it. I think one that's underappreciated, I think, is there's a lot of questioning going on about the way we measure productivity in the economy is even relevant in digital economy where most goods are virtual. So if you can copy your products perfectly at any scale for free, or you can embed things that used to be discrete items into a smartphone, the raw measures of productivity are kind of under some question at the moment. And then, but similarly, I'm doing a lot of work on my family tree at the moment, and a lot of generations of my family were in Northern England in things like silk factories. Okay, and at the time, you can go down, you can look through the census, and there'd be a family of 8 living in a small, 2 up and 2 down cottage, and even the kids of 8 or 9 were listed as silk workers. They were working 6 days a week. Hard, dangerous work. Many of them died in the factories. It works not like that anymore. And although there are different boundaries of it, I think we have to have a little bit of perspective over time about what the role of work and leisure time. For example, the idea of the weekend is a fairly modern invention. I think you're right in terms of we've got to be careful around the boundaries of it. But I think we'd maintain some perspective. I think over what work actually is and what it has been and the direction it's going in. It's very interesting.
Really interesting. Thank you, Steve. Really quickly, some questions have come in around culture and collaboration and community. Bijal, what are your thoughts on how do you create a community when people are physically separated, and how can you replicate that sense of camaraderie you have around the water cooler when there is no water cooler?
Yeah, well, first of all, the fact that there is no water cooler, I think, makes building that sense of community that much more important. I mean, we almost had it by default by being in a physical space. And now that we don't have that anymore, we need to be really intentional about how we are creating that. And so, some practical solutions are moving some of your events that used to be in that physical space to the virtual world. And knowing that there are actually some positives to that. So it's not all gloom and doom because we're working from home. There can be a greater sense of equality and inclusion through the virtual space like this, in the virtual world. And so, but being really intentional, I think that that's my main takeaway for people listening is that there are ways to create it, know that it's important, and then be intentional in how you do it.
Thank you. It's interesting. We wouldn't have hosted an event quite like this in a different scenario. We would have invited everyone to go to a location and participate physically. So I think actually, in terms of productivity, this is probably much more efficient for all of our audience and yourselves. So let's jump quickly back to the poll and see where the results are. It's amazing, actually. 92% of you have said that you will rethink the location strategy and how you will reformulate your plans. And I think that's fascinating. It's interesting to me, I think, as it ties into our final conversation here. So Nicola, let's hear from you first in this next discussion. So many organizations have really long planning cycles and have really established transformation plans, digital or otherwise, where many of our decisions for the next 3 or even 5 years have already been set. And I think as Bijal referenced earlier, agile decision-making is even more important during times of crisis, and it's also more difficult in the face of uncertainty. So how should we be thinking about making business decisions for the future in the framework of this moment, where over the past 8 weeks, we've all learned to put on a certain lens of agility and resilience, versus making decisions for the future using yesterday's processes and data sets?
Yeah, I mean, I think Tom Malone at MIT put it really well at saying that there's been a bullet train driven through strategy at the moment, and that things have happened really fast. And for me, I mean, someone who's been talking about future work styles for a very long time, and certainly when you're looking at virtualized and remote working, the number of excuses as to why you can't do it were multiple, ranging from very valid things like security, for example. Can't do it because it's not secure. We've suddenly had to do it, and it was quite funny. I mean, Steve and I have been talking for a long time around AI being the thing that was going to shift the future of work fundamentally. Well, it might still do that, but actually it was the virus that did it quicker. So I think a lot of people have been having to pivot, and one of the questions I get asked all the time is, okay, so offices, are we going to need them into the future? And it's quite interesting. Pre-COVID, I was talking about offices as a really key collaboration tool. So I always say it's the place that we socialize about work. But this crisis has actually almost turned that completely topsy-turvy. It's turned it upside down. In that if we are going to go into an office, we might not be socializing much about work because we're all going to be socially distanced. We're going to have to reduce the capacity of offices. And of course, previously offices were almost engineered on a factory model, weren't they? So it was all about cost per employee per square, foot of space. And because we're now having to space people out and we can't necessarily socialize in the same way. And I used to talk about the death of Dilbert and his cubicle. Well, cubicles are going to be coming back in, apparently, because we're going to need dividers between people. So actually, again, back to the earlier point, we're almost becoming more intimate and more collaborative using virtualized technology. So it's flipped the model over. Actually, offices are places that we go when we don't have any other choice. So certainly I've been talking to some of our graduates, for example, who don't have good workspaces. They don't live in a mansion. They're sharing with a small flat, or they move back with their parents, and it's not ideal for them. So that's one place that they could go, the office, to actually work in. There are certainly security concerns. So a locked door, it's still a place where you can lock the door and have secure conversations. And certainly I work with a lot of government clients, they want that locked door. It's a place where you can put big equipment or lots of paper, which is very difficult to move to a home location. So yeah, that's probably, although accelerating non-paper-free offices, I think, is certainly, even in legal firms now, they're thinking about different ways of doing their processes because they don't want paper. And then finally, eventually, it probably is going to be in the longer term a place where we go and collaborate about work. But that's a longer term thing, whereas it used to be something we talked about as a very centralized view of an office. Does that mean we get rid of all of our offices? Well, on a practical sense, probably not, because some of us have signed leases, but I think it's forcing this shift into where can I enable my employees to be more productive. And I think that moves strategies into a more work from anywhere strategy around, how do I empower and enable and equip individuals to work wherever they happen to be, rather than necessarily a specific location. So yeah, I think it's changed a lot of the thinking.
That's interesting, and you give sort of real estate as a logical and obvious example. But Bijal, I'd be interested in your thoughts also. As how do we pivot to making decisions for the future, changing maybe even the decisions that we've taken. 6 months ago, I decided X for my business. And now at this moment, I'm realizing that maybe that wasn't the right 18-month plan. How does one coach a company to revisit expectations and pivot?
Yeah, I think the foundational step to making good business decisions in this environment is responding mindfully versus jumping to a decision from a place of reactivity, fear, and ego. And I started personally keeping a quote on my desk just to have some inspiration as we're going through this. It's a quote by Viktor Frankl, and I think it's really relevant to this topic. And he writes, "Between a stimulus and response, there is a space. And in that space is our power to choose our response. And in our response lies our growth and our freedom." And it'd be great if we could just wave a magic wand and grant everybody this skill of being able to respond from that mindful space. But, unfortunately, it's sort of like telling somebody who's depressed to just be happy. We know that does not work. And so we can't expect our employees to become agile and resilient and mindful just overnight. So these old patterns and habits, they're just really well ingrained in our brains. And in order for employees to shift to that space of responding mindfully, they really need support to do things differently. And so there's some emotional support. There is feeling psychologically safe in order to make these changes. And so companies, if you want good decisions, then invest in your employees. And for a really small investment, one practical thing companies can do is get your employees coaches to be able to go through and have a safe space to go through the process of reflection, action, followed by reflection again, in order to accelerate learning and decision-making during times of uncertainty like this.
Just to add to that, I think one of the other leadership implications on a lot of this stuff is to trust by default as opposed to distrust by default. So if you treat your employees like adults, trust them to work. Obviously, yeah, there is some education process and some space you need to make. Absolutely, I agree with the coaches. You know, get a coach. Help try and sort of empower individuals to make the choices that work for them in terms of how they work. I think that's really, choice is really important. The one thing that's been taken away from us at the moment is choice. And I think as we come out of this, those choices are going to be very precious.
Thank you. Steve, I want to hear from you on this.
So two things. I was going to kind of build on Nicola's comments on place and then on Bijal's on decision making. So on place, I think we've seen a dramatic change over the last 20 years where in the knowledge economy, bringing people together with diverse views and skills really played out as being a competitive advantage for the individuals and for the organizations and for the regions. So what we saw was the rise of these kind of innovation superclusters, so Silicon Valley, Boston, New York, London. That may still turn out to be true. And so, for example, if you're looking to where would you put if you want to grow a startup, where will you do it? Well, will you do it in the countryside, or will you still want to do it where there are other startups where you can borrow lawyers? That may be still true. Similarly, we've been seeing this big trend towards urbanization, very much driven by this efficiency in the knowledge economy. Well, suddenly it may well be that suburbia becomes really popular again. You know, suburbia was a 1970s idea that kind of went out of fashion, but it's nice to have a bit of space. It's nice to have somewhere you can go and walk and not be surrounded. So those sorts of things, there's some physics in there that may not change, and we'll have to see. We don't know yet the answer to. We think that people are being as productive at home, but we really haven't done the instrumentation yet to really know that that's true in the long term for innovation, for filling the pipeline of tomorrow's things. And that kind of leads on to this question about decision making, I think. So to my mind, there's been a big change in the way organizations have begun to make decisions as they become more digital. And it's that shift away from thinking about the world as a set of decisions to be made and plans to be executed, to one about there's questions to be asked, questions to be answered, theories to be tested, and experiments to be run. And I think in periods of change, one of the things we need to be doing is instrumenting what we're doing, looking and seeing what runs, maybe running parallel experiments, learning from each other's experiences. And I think this idea of kind of strategic business experiments and learning for those experiments, I think very much fits with Bijal's mindfulness. I think if you look at some of the things we're going, so agile at scale, for example, and pull innovation are very much in that frame. Distributed decision rights, formal experiments, not long-term plans, but progressive movement, regular review. And in some senses, the good thing about digital is it really makes that a lot more possible. So for example, we can now sense and measure a lot more of the changes we can do as work becomes digitized. As we begin to roll 5G and IoT out into everything, we can begin to instrument a lot more of the economy. It's easier to ask more questions when your products are digitally enabled and to conduct more experiments than ever before. It's easier to align resources and to scale than it ever was before. So for example, if you want to bring together, you want to run an AI experiment, you want to see how something may recognize images, well, you can bring together a lot of people to annotate your test sets and stuff like that more easily than ever could before. Similarly, we're seeing distributed call centers being set up to deal with the contact tracing for COVID in ways that, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of contact tracers being needed. That kind of ability to collaborate and to draw together resources at scale. I think that's, and Nicola's right, I think this is very difficult for many managers that are used to a command and control kind of environment where you can make a plan, you can have a 3-year plan, you can invest in it. We're moving to somewhere where you want to build flexibility into your planning and then to make the decisions in a much more adaptive experimental way. That's obviously hard with large capital investments and large with, if you're building a new tower block in the middle of Singapore, that's a kind of tricky decision. But a lot of other things can be handled in this much more adaptive way if it's done with rigor. And this data-driven decision making, I think, is going to become much more much more common, and it's this mindfulness that's about all decisions that the Bijal mentions. It's not an inevitability about decisions. It's a kind of an adaptive, data-driven, insight-driven conversation around them.
That's fantastic, and appreciate that. I'm glad I don't have any personal plans to invest in a tower block in Singapore at the moment. One quick question that came in advance, actually, Steve, just for you quickly, and then I'm going to throw one to you, Bijal, quickly. Do you have any insight into what you believe will be the most critical technological step in a work-from-home ecosystem?
That's a fine question. So one of the issues that has been a problem has been the availability of reliable, robust internet access, the ability to give workforce wherever they are access to the kind of the digital work of the future. And I think that's a question for both kind of like telecommunications companies rolling out their fiber infrastructure, their 5G infrastructure, for policymakers about investment, and also for companies when they start to build their collaboration infrastructure for the people. I think the other one is going to be that, and I think that really applies to the kind of the knowledge economy. I think the other side is going to be what's going to happen in the future of manufacturing. How are we going to rethink manufacturing and supply chains going forward? We talked about this kind of this increasing relationship between people and robots in manufacturing. So in some sense, you could view that as saying we're going to automate everything. But the reality is what tends to happen is we end up with effectively things like cobots. So machines that enhance and support factory workers. So we're working with companies that, for example, say, well, there's a real scarcity of skilled factory workers. We want to give those skilled workers, we want to amplify them. We want to give them 3 apprentices, and we haven't got 3 apprentices, so we're going to give them 3 robots that scale up what they do. And I think if you look globally, I think there's still it's not as if we saturated the kind of the global demand for things like refrigerators and TVs and stuff like that. So I think that's going to be the other aspect. So there's going to be some divergence, I suspect, between the knowledge economy and the physical economy and the supply chains that go with those. But data, artificial intelligence, connectivity really play a core role in that. So, for example, connectivity on the factory floor, data collection on the factory floor to train these robots to be able to get to adapt to the workplaces is just the same as it is to enable the workforce in, for example, the Navajo reserves of Arizona to be engaged with the global community. I don't know what's it.
Thank you. Bijal, really quickly, what are your thoughts on the role, or how much, I guess, compassion and empathy will play a role in challenging the status quo environment?
Wow, you said really quickly? Okay, let's see.
2 minutes and we still need to wrap up. So
okay, let's see. Around the status quo. Well, I think the status quo is just shooken up right now. I mean, as I mentioned, I think the power is going down in the organization because you don't have that department head or the singular leader of an organization delivering the message and being around physically in the same office space. So I think that the status quo is gone. I think there's a new reality that I think employees and team culture and organization culture will be adapting to.
Yeah, and empathy and compassion are going to be a huge part of that. Nicola, your quick thought?
I mean, to Steve's point, the connectivity piece is absolutely critical. Feedback on what's working and what isn't working in this mass global experiment at the moment. The first comment is that cloud's made things a lot easier. So rather than having to, do a lot of on-premise stuff, that people have been able to very rapidly move to the cloud. But obviously, one of the problems then is you need connectivity to the cloud for it to work. So you might, we've had a lot of people say, I'm really enjoying not doing a commute, particularly here in the UK, commutes are really long. So, that people aren't missing that, but frankly, they could save as much time as possible on a commute. And you don't need to invest in road infrastructure. But if you haven't got the connectivity, it really isn't going to work in the first place. So we're just finding getting the basics right is absolutely vital here.
Yep, thank you. So we are at time. So I'm going to wrap up, just summarize with a few key messages that I heard from you guys. And thank you. 1, resilient people enable resilient organizations. Collaboration is a leadership challenge. Digital behaviors are more important than ever, and we need to lean into transformative technologies. We should redefine or rethink productivity, and we should shift from decisions to be made to questions to be asked and lessons to be learned so that we can respond mindfully. Merged a couple of thoughts there. Thank you to our panelists, and thanks to all of our attendees. We really appreciate your support. And to thank you for being with us today, BT in the Americas will be donating $25 for each attendee to a nationwide network of food banks called Feeding America. These are obviously very trying times across the world, and we wish you all the best. Stay safe and stay healthy. Thank you.
Thanks, Jen.